Please come. My husband wants to see you. We don't think he has much time left. Those were the first words I heard when I answered my phone that morning. The voice on the other end belonged to Pastor Emmanuel's wife. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. I had known the pastor for years. The last thing I expected was a call telling me he was dying. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the fear in her voice. The kind of fear you hear when someone has seen something they cannot explain. An hour later, I was standing outside their home, completely unaware that I was about to witness the final confession of a man no one had dared question for decades. When I arrived at the house, Pastor Emmanuel's wife met me at the door. I immediately knew this was not an ordinary visit. The moment I saw her face, I knew things were worse than I had imagined. She looked exhausted. The confident woman I remembered from church programs and conferences seemed to have disappeared. Her eyes were swollen, her face was pale, and it looked as though she had not slept properly in days. Without saying much, she stepped aside and allowed me in. As we walked towards the bedroom, I could hear her husband speaking loudly from inside. At first, I thought someone else was in the room with him. Then I realized he was speaking to people neither of us could see. His wife noticed the confusion on my face, and she said, "I don't know what is happening anymore." When she opened the door, I barely recognized him. The man who had once filled stadiums and commanded the respect of thousands now looked weak and broken. For a few moments, he continued staring into an empty corner of the room. Then, suddenly, he became calm. He turned towards us, looked first at his wife, then at me, and quietly said, "My time is almost over. There is something both of you need to know." The house was unusually quiet. His wife moved closer to the bed. I remained standing where I was. He took a deep breath and looked at both of us. What he said next would force me to question everything I thought I knew about him. Pastor Emmanuel remained silent for several seconds after speaking. Neither his wife nor I said a word. The room felt heavier than before. He looked towards the window and slowly shook his head. Then he spoke again. He said, "I should have said this many years ago. For years, people believed they knew who I was. They believed they knew how this ministry started. They believed they knew why God blessed it. They were wrong. Everything that happened after the church began, the crowds, the miracles, the fame, the influence, none of it can be understood unless you know what happened before anyone knew my name." Neither of us interrupted him. We simply listened. For the first time since I had entered the room, his voice sounded steady. Then he turned towards me. His eyes settled on my face, and he said, "You trusted me." I didn't know how to respond. It was true. Years earlier, he had spoken words over my life that later came to pass. That experience had convinced me that God was using him. He nodded slowly and said, "That is why I asked my wife to call you. I needed someone who knew me before all this ended." His wife wiped away tears. Still, neither of us understood what he was trying to confess. Then he said something that made my heart sink. He said, "The man people saw behind the pulpit was not the whole man. The ministry they celebrated was built on a decision I made when I was young, a decision I spent the rest of my life trying to outrun. And if I am going to tell you the truth, I must begin at the beginning." As he spoke those words, my mind drifted back many years to the first day I met him. back to the day he gave me a prophecy that changed my life, back to a time when I believed he was one of the most remarkable men I had ever encountered, and back to a secret that had already begun shaping his destiny long before I ever walked into his church. The first time I met Pastor Emmanuel was almost 17 years before that phone call from his wife. At the time, I was going through one of the most difficult seasons of my life. Nothing seemed to be working. The plans I had made for myself were falling apart one after another, and no matter how hard I tried, it felt as though I was moving backwards instead of forward. It was during that period that I visited his church. The building was much smaller than I expected. Back then, the ministry had not yet grown into the empire it would later become. There were no television cameras, no security teams, no convoys of expensive vehicles, just a simple church filled with people who genuinely believed God was doing something extraordinary through their pastor. During the service, he looked across the congregation, then pointed directly at me. I had never met him before. I had never spoken to him, yet somehow he seemed to know exactly who he was looking for. Then he began speaking. What happened next is something I had never forgotten. He mentioned details about my life that nobody in that church could have known. Details I had never shared publicly. Details I rarely discussed even with close friends. One after another, he spoke about struggles I was facing and decisions I had been wrestling with in private. I remember standing there in complete shock. Then he gave me a prophecy, one that involved a situation I had been praying about for months. When he finished speaking, he simply told me to trust God and remain patient. That was all. The service continued, but my mind remained fixed on what had just happened. For months afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then something remarkable happened. The prophecy came to pass, exactly as he had described it. From that moment forward, my respect for Pastor Emmanuel changed. I was no longer listening to stories other people told about him. I had experienced something myself, and that was how he became a father figure in my life. By then, the ministry had begun growing rapidly. The church expanded. Branches appeared in different cities. The crowd became larger. The testimonies became more frequent. Everywhere, people spoke about Pastor Emmanuel with the same mixture of admiration and awe. To many people, questioning him felt almost unthinkable. If someone criticized him, church members quickly defended him. If someone raised concerns, they were accused of jealousy. And if anyone challenged his authority, they were usually ignored. The more successful the ministry became, the less willing people became to ask difficult questions, including me. Looking back now, that was probably the first mistake many of us made, because while everyone was celebrating the public ministry, there were parts of Pastor Emmanuel's story that almost nobody knew, parts he had carefully hidden for years, parts that would eventually return to haunt him. And as I sat beside his bed that day, listening to his confession, I realized he was finally preparing to reveal them. As Pastor Emmanuel rested against his pillow, his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. For a moment, it seems as though he had forgotten we were in the room. Then he began speaking again. He said, "When people look at my life, they see the church, the crowd, and the years of ministry. What they don't see is the young man I used to be. I wasn't always respected. I wasn't always successful." Pastor Emmanuel explained that before the ministry grew, he had spent years struggling. He preached in small gatherings, traveled from village to village, prayed for people, fasted for days, yet nothing seemed to happen. While other ministers around him appeared to be growing, he remained stuck. According to him, those were some of the most frustrating years of his life. The disappointment slowly turned into desperation. And desperation, he admitted, can make people dangerous. He paused for a long moment, then looked directly at his wife. Tears began forming in her eyes, and then he said, "I never told you how bad things became. There came a point where I became willing to do almost anything. I mean anything to change my situation. When I made that decision, I convinced myself I was doing it for the greater good. I told myself the ministry would eventually justify it, but I was wrong. And the day I crossed that line was the day everything began. And for the first time since the confession started, I realized we were finally approaching the secret he had carried for decades. There was a man. I met him during that period where everything was not working for me. And what started as an advice is what brought me here. This, I have spent years regretting that very decision." According to him, the man was older and seemed to know things about him that nobody else did. Their first meeting lasted only a short time, but before they parted ways, the man made him a promise that immediately appealed to every frustration he had been carrying. Pastor Emmanuel continued, "He told me the ministry will grow. He told me people would travel from everywhere to hear me preach. He told me I would become known far beyond my own community. And almost everything he said happened. The crowds came, the church grew, the influence came. You see, everything he was saying was true. We had all seen it happen. The ministry had exploded over the years. What none of us understood was why he was speaking about it with so much regret." Then he answered the question himself. He said, "The problem wasn't what I received. The problem was what I agreed to in order to receive it. For years, I convinced myself I could ignore it. I convinced myself I could preach enough sermons, pray enough prayers, and help enough people to escape the consequences of that decision. But every year, I knew the depth was getting closer." He slowly shook his head. For the first time since the confession began, I understood what had been tormenting him. This wasn't merely the fear of death. This was the fear of finally facing something he had spent decades trying to outrun. Pastor Emmanuel looked at me and then at his wife, and with tears running down his face, he said, "The ministry everyone celebrated was built on a covenant I should never have made." The covenant was never supposed to last forever. His wife asked him what he meant by that, and he said, "I was told there would come a day when everything would be settled." For years, he explained, he had tried not to think about that day. Whenever fear appeared, he buried himself in ministry. Whenever guilt surfaced, he preached another sermon. Whenever doubt arose, he convinced himself that the years ahead would somehow give him enough time to escape the consequences. But now, there was no more time. His body was failing, and according to him, the day he had spent decades avoiding had finally arrived. He turned towards his wife, and then he said, "I should have told you long ago." And then he looked back at me and said, "The things you witnessed when you arrived today, they started weeks ago." He explained that he had begun seeing the same figures repeatedly. At first, He dismissed them as dreams. Then they appeared while he was awake. Every night, they came closer. Every night, the fear became worse. Sleep became impossible, and peace disappeared. Even prayer no longer brought him comfort. He said he knew why they were there. For the first time since I had known him, Pastor Emmanuel sounded completely defeated by the weight of a decision he had carried for decades. He took a deep breath and said, "The covenant required my devotion, my loyalty, and eventually my soul. I spent years pretending I could serve two masters, years pretending I could outrun what I had agreed to. But nothing can outrun the truth forever." His wife broke down completely. The powerful pastor, who had once stood before thousands, now looked like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Then he opened his eyes and looked directly at us, and he said, "There is one final thing you both need to know." And as he spoke those words, I realized the confession was not over. The most painful part was still to come. The room was completely silent. Neither his wife nor I spoke. We simply waited. He looked exhausted. It seemed as though every word cost him energy. For a moment, I thought he might stop speaking altogether. Then he slowly turned towards his wife. The pain in his eyes was impossible to miss. For decades, she had stood beside him. She had celebrated every victory, endured every challenge, defended him when others criticized him. And now she was discovering that the man she thought she knew had been carrying secrets for most of their marriage. As his fingers trembled, he said, "I am sorry. My devotion, my loyalty, and eventually my soul all were not enough. And so, our first son had to go to please the powers I had consulted." The wife asked him what he meant by that. And then he said again, "I had to sacrifice our first son to maintain the gift that was given to me by the powers I consulted." His wife lowered her head and cried, not the cry of someone mourning a dying husband, the cry of someone whose entire understanding of the past had suddenly been shattered. Pastor Emmanuel turned towards me. There was something different in his eyes now. The fear was gone. The panic that had filled the room when I first arrived had disappeared. It was as though finally telling the truth had lifted a weight he could no longer carry. And then he said, "The reason I asked my wife to call you is because people trusted me. Many of them still do. The crowds saw the miracles. They saw the growth. They saw the success. But they never saw the price." Those words settled heavily in the room. You see, for years, thousands had admired the ministry. Many had wished for the same influence, the same recognition, the same results. Yet, according to the man who had lived it, none of them understood what it had cost him. Then he spoke the words that will remain with me long after he was gone. He said, "Never become so desperate for success that you stop asking where it comes from, and never trust a man simply because he appears powerful." I felt a chill run through my body because years earlier, that was exactly what I had done. The prophecy he gave me had come to pass. The growth of the ministry had been real. The influence had been undeniable. Like countless others, I had seen the results and assumed I knew the story behind them. I had never questioned anything, neither had most of the people around him. That realization hurt more than I expected. His final words were, "Truth always awaits." Nobody spoke after that. The room remained silent. The conversation was over. I sat there for a while trying to process everything I had heard. The man I had admired, the man thousands admired, the man nobody dared question had finally confessed. As I left the house that evening, the sun was beginning to set. I remember looking back at the building one last time before getting into my car. My mind was full of questions, but one thought remained louder than all the others. For years, people had been amazed by what Pastor Emmanuel became. Yet, in the end, the thing that mattered most was not his influence, his church, or his reputation. It was the truth he had spent his entire life trying to escape. And now, at last, that truth had caught up with him. The wife called me exactly 4 days later and told me he had passed away. But his final confession has stayed with me ever since, not because it revealed the secret of a powerful man, but because it revealed something far more dangerous. How easily people can mistake success for righteousness, and how often the questions nobody dares to ask turn out to be the ones that matter most.